I stepped into the Grand Monarch Hotel ballroom in Charleston, South Carolina, with my husband Michael at my side and our 6-year-old son Leo tugging at his bow tie. The chandeliers scattered light across polished marble like broken sugar. A string quartet lifted the room into that easy hum of wealth, the kind that makes every conversation sound elegant, no matter what is being said. I told myself this was just another reception, another place where people would ask about my firm, and pretend the hors d'oeuvres were enough for dinner. I belonged in rooms like this now. That was not a boast. It was a hard-won fact. Then I saw the bride. I did not process the lace first, or the pearls, or the bouquet. I saw the tilt of the head and the practiced smile that never quite reached her. Eyes. I knew the way she leaned toward a joke so she could claim it as her own, the way she touched a sleeve to claim a person too. There was no mistaking her. Abigail Lawson, my sister. The air felt thinner, as if the room had been vacuum sealed and I was the only one who noticed. I had not seen Abigail in years. Not since the afternoon she stood in our parents' kitchen in North Carolina and told me my college fund was gone. She said it like a weather report. Calm voice, dry eyes. Our parents, Charles and Elaine, stared at the tiled floor as if the grout lines could explain everything. They had taken $82,500 to cover shortfalls at the family clinic, and then they let Abigail spread the cover story that I had blown the money on a boyfriend and a car I did not own. The lie traveled faster than the truth. It always does. That night, I packed a duffel, drove to Atlanta, and learned what it means to be the person who does not have a safety net. I waited tables at a 24-hour diner and mopped offices after midnight. I learned how to read contracts when I took a temp job at a logistics company, then how to write them. I learned how to speak with confidence even when I did not feel it. The first year, I made $32,000 and thought I was rich because none of it depended on anyone's favor. 2 years later, I made my first 6-figure bonus and sat on the floor of my apartment counting it twice, not because I did not trust the bank, but because I could not believe it had come from my effort alone. Now I run Mason and Blake Consulting. The name originated from my grandmother's maiden name and the street where I signed our first client in a sunlit co-working space with wobbly chairs. 2 months ago, we closed a merger that put $20 million on the table and brought 3 regional firms under our umbrella. It made headlines in trade publications, the kind of articles that people skim on flights and then mention later as if they had been investors all along. That was why I had been invited to this wedding. Not because Abigail wanted me here, because Daniel Whitmore, the groom, works in a world where prestige has a mailing list, and my name had finally appeared on it. Michael felt me pause and slid his hand to the small of my back. He is a surgeon, precise in everything except how he loves me. That part is generous and unguarded. His tuxedo was a shade darker than the room, and he looked like the quiet man at a gala who would know exactly what to say when someone's ego catches fire and needs putting out. Leo, meanwhile, was all elbows and energy, pulling at the bow tie he had begged to wear and then discovered he did not like. "This thing is trying to strangle me," he whispered. 2 hours, I said, crouching to straighten the knot. Then, the pool at the hotel. You can cannonball until the lifeguard begs for mercy. He grinned, and for a moment the pressure lifted. We found our table. Place cards in tidy script, crystal water goblets, a low centerpiece that smelled like June even though the calendar still insisted it was April. I told myself I could sit through vows and toasts, shake hands, say congratulations, and leave before anyone remembered to ask me about the past. People remembered me for other reasons first. An executive from Boston crossed the room to say he had read my interview about mentorship programs for first-generation professionals. A hospital board member from Savannah asked if I would consider a pitch for their leadership retreat. A city councilman who should have been working his side of the room asked for a meeting to discuss small business incentives. Their questions orbited the same sun. They had seen my name and wanted to be closer to it. I do not mean that unkindly. That is how rooms like this function. There is always a list. Tonight, I was on it. Across the dance floor, Abigail watched. She had the Whitmore smile now, the one that arrives attached to a family of donors whose names are on the wings of museums. She looked beautiful, I can admit that. Her dress had a clean line that made it look inevitable. Fate in silk. When our eyes finally met, she blinked, the way you do when you mistake a person for someone else, and then realize the reverse is true. My parents approached the choreography of people who prefer to direct a scene rather than star in it. My mother wore navy and pearls, and my father's tuxedo fit like he expected to receive an award. They greeted Michael with the politeness reserved for professionals they cannot control, then turned to Leo and declared him handsome, as if the pronouncement would earn them a connection he had not offered. "You look well," my mother said to me, and I could hear the effort it took to make the words neutral. "We hear your work is going well, too." "It is," I said. "We closed in March. Savannah has been good to us." I did not add details about our house because it would have felt like tossing gasoline toward a match. Still, I thought of that house, the one with the white porch 2 blocks from the river, the one we bought for $1.4 million after I realized our growing company needed a home base that felt both grounded and forward-facing. I thought of the office we built on Bay Street with glass walls that force me to keep my desk clean. I thought of Saturday mornings with pancakes and sticky counters and no meetings until noon. My father cleared his throat, the old signal that a lecture was coming. "Abigail is very happy," he said. "This is a strong match. Daniel is a good man and his family is very supportive." "I wish them well," I said, and meant it, which surprised me a little. "We should talk sometime," my mother added. "Family should talk." I looked at her, at the pearl earrings I had once admired as a teenager, at the steady gaze that had turned absent when I needed her most. "Family should tell the truth," I said. "Talking is easy." She took a breath like a swimmer about to dive in cold water, then let it out untouched. My parents moved on, spreading compliments like confetti, and I stood with Michael and felt the old ache recede. It never goes away entirely, but it does grow smaller when the life you built has more weight than the life you lost. Dinner arrived. Saffron risotto, seared sea bass, a salad so delicate it felt like a rumor. A microphone appeared, and an uncle I did not recognize told a long joke about golf. Daniel thanked the guests with the polished charm of someone raised to be listened to. Then Abigail took the mic. Her voice ran smooth across the room, and for a few minutes I could pretend none of this was personal. She thanked her new family, her friends, and her mentors. When she reached our parents, she paused, and I saw it. The briefest fracture in the porcelain. A flicker of something that was not gratitude. "Thank you to the people who taught me how to be brave," she said, and for a heartbeat her eyes landed on me. I did not clap first. I did not clap last. I just kept time with the room and reminded myself that endings do not always look like door slams. Sometimes they look like a steady inhale followed by a choice. After the toasts, people swirled toward the dance floor. Michael asked if I wanted to leave. Leo had wriggled out of his chair and into a game of tag with 2 other children who looked similarly relieved to be off script. I said I wanted one more pass through the room, not to be seen, to see. At the bar, a venture capitalist from New York asked about a fund I am building to support founders from overlooked backgrounds. At a table near the band, a hospital administrator from Charleston asked if I would keynote a conference. Near the doors, a woman with carefully styled hair introduced herself as a reporter and asked if I had a moment on Monday for a profile. Each conversation added a small weight to the side of the scale where my present sits. The past did not disappear. It simply had competition. When I reached the edge of the dance floor again, Abigail was there. No entourage, no groom. Just a bride with her bouquet lowered to her side, eyes level with mine. "Congratulations," I said. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, but her right hand twitched against the stems. "You look different." "Time does that," she nodded. The string quartet slid into something lively, and guests began to clap along. We stood outside the rhythm for a beat too long. "I heard about your firm," she said. "People talk." "They do," I said. "I'm glad for you," she added, and the words came out fragile but intact. "Good," I said. There was a time I would have offered her an apology for the discomfort of this moment, as if my success were a breach of etiquette. I have retired from that role. A flash went off to our left. The photographer had captured us in a frame that would later confuse anyone trying to map the story. 2 women, with similar eyes and similar jawlines, standing just far enough apart to make the space between them its subject. "Enjoy your night," I said, and stepped back into my life. Michael wrapped an arm around my shoulder as we found Leo, who had managed to loosen his bow tie into something jaunty. We crossed the marble toward the exit, past the place cards and the centerpieces and the endless gloss. Outside, Charleston smelled like night-blooming jasmine and the river beyond the houses. Our driver opened the door. Leo asked about the pool. Michael promised 30 minutes, and then a bedtime story about a daring pirate who retired early to become a pediatrician. I looked back once, not at the hotel but at the idea of it, the way a person looks at an old photograph and recognizes herself, without wanting to go back. My sister was inside that ballroom playing a role I had once wanted. I was outside with my family, holding a life I had built piece by piece. I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm. That was new. "Home tomorrow?" Michael asked as the car eased away from the curb. "Home," I said, picturing the white porch in Savannah, the small herb garden Leo insists is a jungle, the framed certificate from the first client who ever took a chance on me, the spreadsheet on my laptop that proves the numbers will work for a new scholarship I have been sketching in the margins of my days. In the window, the chandelier light slipped and scattered, then disappeared. I took a breath that belonged only to me. The night did not answer. It did not need to. The reception moved forward like an expensive clock, precise, deliberate, and gilded at every turn. The string quartet transitioned seamlessly from Vivaldi to an instrumental version of a pop song everyone in the room recognized, but no one would dare sing along to. Waiters glided past in synchronized lines, carrying trays of champagne coupes, stacked in delicate towers that shimmered under the light. The menu read like a poem in another language, each course more elaborate than the last. Saffron-infused risotto with Maine lobster, Wagyu beef medallions draped in truffle butter, a dessert that looked more like a museum piece than food. On the surface, it was perfect. But beneath the gloss, I began to see the hairline fractures. I was speaking with Michael about the absurdity of balancing caviar on a wafer when an investor from Boston, Mark Avery, a man I'd partnered with on a logistics expansion deal last year, spotted me across the room. His face lit up the way people's do when they think they've discovered an asset in an unexpected place. He clasped my hand in both of his, congratulating me on the merger as if we were old friends, rather than business acquaintances. His voice carried enough to draw glances from nearby tables, and I didn't miss the way Abigail's head turned sharply in our direction. When Mark asked how I knew the bride, the corner of Abigail's smile twitched. It was subtle. A half-second? Break in the smooth veneer, but I caught it. She had built her image here on something fragile, the idea that her world existed independent of mine. And now, with every handshake, I was proof that the narrative wasn't as airtight as she had led people to believe. The pattern repeated itself. Conversations I had with strangers became invisible threads, stitching together a different version of who I was. People began connecting dots. The interview I'd given to Forbes Women in Business, the charity gala where my mentorship program had been mentioned, the regional award I'd won for leadership the year before. I wasn't just the bride's sister anymore. In some corners of the room, I was a more compelling headline than she was. It wasn't long before my parents approached. Charles and Elaine Lawson moved with the kind of grace that comes from decades of navigating social spaces where appearances are currency. My father's tuxedo fit as though it had been made for him that morning, and my mother's navy gown shimmered under the chandelier's light. Their smiles were as polished as the silverware, practiced, precise, and devoid of warmth. "Savannah treating you well?" my father asked, his tone even, but his eyes scanning the room behind me as though searching for someone more important to greet. "It is," I replied. "Michael and I love it there." My mother didn't ask about my work. She never did. But she launched into a glowing account of Abigail's new life in Connecticut. "Daniel is such a good match," she said, her pearls catching the light. "The Whitmore family is influential. They've been incredibly supportive." She stressed the word supportive in a way that made it clear she believed influence and support were the same thing. I nodded politely, letting her speak. But I noticed something different this time. a faint tightness in her jaw when people nearby greeted me by name without an introduction. My parents had spent years controlling the family story, ensuring that I was cast as the reckless one, the failure, the child who had squandered her opportunities. Now, here in this ballroom, they could feel the script slipping out of their hands. Not long after, a board member from a regional hospital stopped me to discuss a consulting contract. His handshake was firm, his interest genuine, and I could see my father watching from across the room, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Then came a city councilman from Savannah who'd heard about my corporate mentorship program for underprivileged students. He wanted to know if we could meet next month to discuss city sponsorship. Each conversation was another small chip in the facade my parents had so carefully maintained. Michael caught my eye from across the room. His expression was unreadable to anyone who didn't know him, but I saw the trace of a smile. He recognized what was happening too. This was my territory now, not theirs. The people here weren't approaching me out of obligation or bloodline. They came because they had something to gain from knowing me, and I had something to offer in return. As the evening wore on, I noticed Abigail's avoidance becoming deliberate. In the beginning, she'd met my gaze with quick, polite acknowledgments. Now she turned away before our eyes could meet at all. She was careful to keep Daniel between us during photographs, careful to engage deeply with guests whenever I passed near her. I wondered if she was remembering the last time we'd been in the same room, when she'd cornered me in our parents' kitchen and delivered the news about my college fund with all the emotion of someone announcing that the store was out of milk. I wondered if she remembered the lie she'd spun, that I'd burned through the money on a frivolous lifestyle, and whether she could feel in this moment that the truth was beginning to leak through the seams. By the time the dessert course arrived, the power dynamic in the room had shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it like a change in barometric pressure. My parents no longer lingered near me to control the conversation. Abigail kept to her curated circle. And I, without trying, had become part of the evening's unspoken intrigue, a quiet disruption to a carefully staged tableau. When the band began to play, Michael leaned in and whispered, "You're winning, you know." "It's not a competition," I said, though I understood what he meant. Winning wasn't the goal, but reclaiming my place, not in their lives, but in my own. That mattered. As I watched couples step onto the dance floor in champagne, glasses clink in the background, I realized the cracks I'd seen tonight weren't just in my family's image of me. They were in the foundation of the story they'd told themselves for years. And once cracks start to form, no matter how much polish you pour over them, they only spread. The months after the wedding stretched out in a kind of bright quiet, the kind that looks like peace on the surface while the weather changes far out, at sea. At home in Savannah, mornings smelled like coffee and river air. Leo learned to ride his bike without training wheels along our block, shouting for me to watch every 20 feet. Michael's rotation eased, and he started coming home before sunset twice a week, which felt like a luxury equal to any line item in our budget. At the office on Bay Street, my team settled into a cadence that made the hard problems feel like puzzles rather than emergencies. I told myself this was what stability felt like, and then I watched it meet the past. The first tremor arrived as gossip, that soft currency of every city that has more charm than streets. Someone forwarded me a link from a Hartford lifestyle blog. The post described a newlywed couple with famous last names who were already living apart. There were no names in the piece, only careful hints, yet the comment section was not subtle. I closed my laptop, walked to the porch, and forced myself to name what I felt. Not triumph, not relief. Something more complicated, like the ache after a hard run, when your body knows you did the right thing but has to recalibrate to understand. A week later, a friend in Boston texted me a screenshot. Illegal filing. Public record. Daniel Whitmore had filed for divorce. Irreconcilable differences. The phrase that fills a blank the size of a continent. The society pages made a meal of it. Photographs taken at better angles than the truth allows. Headlines that smiled even when the sentences did not. I read them in the same way I watch storms roll across the horizon at Tybee Island, aware of their power, aware of the distance, unwilling to pretend either one has anything to do with me. At the office, I stayed busy with work that did. We were integrating the second of the 3 regional firms we had acquired in March, and integration is the place where pretty plans meet human habits. I flew to Charlotte twice, to Nashville once, and drove home both times from the airport so late that the toll booth lights looked like tiny moons. During leadership meetings, we refined a playbook that would live long after this merger was an ancient story. We set aside $250,000 for a founder fellowship that would bring in a cohort of 10 each year, people who had talent and grit but lacked introductions. I circled the number in my notebook, then wrote out the math for a scholarship I had not yet named. From that steady ground, I heard the second tremor, and this time it did not look like gossip. It looked like a seal on a federal letterhead. The Lawson Family Clinic, the one my parents had built from a small practice into an operation with multiple locations, was under audit. The announcement read like a binder. If you have never seen that kind of letter, you might think it would be dramatic. It is not. It is controlled and precise, a list of what will be examined, a list of what has already been found. There were references to coding irregularities, to billing patterns that did not reconcile with standard practice, to reimbursements that did not match documented care. The language carried no heat at all, which somehow made it feel colder. Information came in pieces. The clinic had billed certain procedures at higher reimbursement levels than the records justified. Patients had been scheduled for tests too often. Charts had been edited after the fact, a detail that made my stomach drop in a way none of the numbers had. There were interviews and subpoenas, a timeline that accelerated without raising its voice. Licenses were suspended for the duration of the investigation. Vendors pulled away without fanfare. Lines that had once wrapped around the block for flu shots were gone by the following week. People who had believed in my parents called to ask me what was happening, as if I might have a private line into the truth. I had only what they had. The difference was that I had a memory of an older ledger, the one that recorded my future as an asset to be redirected when their calculations demanded it. I did not call reporters. I did not comment. I did not post. I made dinner, reviewed contracts, listened to Leo's stories about a science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda, and reminded myself that quiet is not the same as indifference. Quiet can be a choice. News moves in circles, and my parents lived at the center of one. Their friends closed ranks at first, then thinned out as details sharpened. Statements appeared in a polished font with the right tone of concern. They used phrases like administrative oversight and necessary review, the verbal equivalents of gauze. An attorney stood in front of a courthouse and said that everyone was cooperating fully. No one said much about the patients whose names sat, beside billing codes that did not match their care. The scale of it seeped through the carefully closed doors, and even silence could not hold back its shape. There is a sound that happens when a story breaks open. It is not the sound of glass shattering. It is softer and heavier, the sound of something long propped up, finally sitting down. The clinic had been the justification for so much. My parents had spoken about it in a way that asked for forgiveness before the bill arrived. They had said community when they meant reputation. They had said service when they meant status. They had said family when what they required was obedience. When the audit became public, those words turned sideways. People began to look at them from a different angle and saw, perhaps for the first time, the space between what was said and what was done. In April, I stopped answering unknown numbers. In May, I received a message from an address I did not recognize but somehow knew by the tilt of the first sentence. The subject line was only my name. Inside, there were 3 pages in looping handwriting that leaned forward, as if hurrying to its point. She did not ask for forgiveness. She wrote that first, a kind of preface, and then she gave me the facts as she remembered them. She had signed the withdrawal slip for my college fund because our father told her to. She had repeated the story about my recklessness because our mother had fed it to her in phrases so calm they sounded like wisdom. She had known about the billing issues at the clinic years before, not their full extent, but enough to understand that the numbers depended on more than care. She wrote about fear, the kind that convinces a person that complicity is safer than courage. She wrote that shame had become her native language, that by the time she realized she could not translate it anymore, it was already speaking for her. Read the letter in the soft light of late afternoon, the kind that makes the white paint on our porch glow faintly. Michael was at the hospital, and Leo was building a fort in the living room with every throw pillow we own. I sat in one of the rocking chairs and read slowly, letting the words stack without correcting them. Somewhere behind the house, a boat horn sounded, a long, low note that reminded me some distances can be crossed only by water, and even then, only with patience. The second page held the part that undid me. She wrote that she had watched me at the wedding as if she were watching a person she had once known but had been too foolish to befriend. She wrote that when the investor congratulated me across the room, she felt something break loose inside, that she had been holding on to for years. Not resentment, not envy, but the lie that our parents had handed both of us. The lie that said the only way to be safe was to be close to their power. She wrote that seeing me respected for what I had, built without them, was like seeing the sky over the ocean on a clear day, a color she had forgotten existed. I folded the letter and unfolded it again. I thought about the version of myself who had stood in our parents' kitchen and been told her future was gone, the version who had taken a matchbook from the diner where she worked and written the number of a cheap apartment in the margin. I thought about the version of my sister who had believed that inheritance equals identity, and how that belief can become a cage that looks like a crown. There were practical consequences, too. The audit became an investigation. Words like restitution entered the conversation. There were hearings that my parents attended with shoulders squared and eyes directed at the middle distance. The clinic's sign came down for what the press releases called a temporary closure, and the letters on the facade left a pale shadow on the brick where the sun had failed to reach for years. Alumni committees paused their invitations. Boards reconsidered their memberships. My father's voice, once confident at a podium, was now heard mostly in statements filtered through counsel. At Mason and Blake, we kept building. I met with my finance lead, and we finalized the budget for the fellowship. We selected our first 10 fellows and reserved a conference room for their orientation. We set aside time for them to meet mentors who would not ask for anything in exchange for their guidance. I reviewed a draft for a program that would pair high school seniors in Chatham County with business owners who would let them shadow for a week in exchange for a small stipend we would fund. In the margin, I wrote a note to myself about a scholarship, endowment, then added a second note about a name. Mine. Not out of vanity, but because reclaiming your name is a way to keep other people from writing their history over it. On a Saturday morning in mid-May, I walked with Leo to the farmer's market and let him choose the ripest strawberries he could find. We passed a table where a woman sold pottery glazed in river colors. She told us she had left a corporate job to make dishes because she liked the way clay taught her what her hands could do when time slowed down. I bought 2 bowls and thought about how many people never get the chance to find out what work feels like when it belongs to them. When we got home, the letter was still on the hall table. I carried it to the porch again and read it one more time, then slipped it into a folder in my desk. Not to forget it. To keep it from becoming a relic that I took out only when I needed to feel justified. I did not call Abigail that day. I did not call her the next week. I let the letter sit until the noise around the investigation lowered from a shout to a hum, and I paid attention to what remained once the spectacle thinned out. What remained was simple. I had a husband who loved me without keeping score. I had a son who believed I could fix anything with tape and an apple slice. I had a company that paid people well to do work, that sharpened them rather than wearing them down. I had a house with a white porch that caught the morning light in a way that made even hard days begin with a promise. And I had a choice not had when I was 18. I could decide what to do next without asking permission from anyone at all. That is what the fall looked like from where I stood. It did not look like a crash. It looked like gravity remembered. It looked like a structure that had been built on borrowed definitions, finally surrendering to the shape of the truth. It looked like a story that had been told one way for years, taking a breath and admitting that another version existed, one that did not require my silence to keep standing. June arrived with heat that lifted from the streets by mid-morning and clung to the porches by dusk. On a Tuesday that looked ordinary in every way, I stood at my office window on Bay Street and decided to make a call I had practiced a dozen times in my head. I did not write a script. I did not rehearse an apology I did not owe. I dialed the ITI number Abigail had placed at the bottom of her letter and listened to the ring travel forward through everything that had come before. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was quiet, careful, the way a person speaks when she does not know yet if the conversation is a bridge or a cliff. I told her I had read her letter twice, then a third time. I told her I believed she was telling the truth as she knew it now. I told her there was an opening in the community outreach wing at Mason and Blake. It was program work, the kind that required stubborn kindness and clean spreadsheets. The job came with a salary that started at $72,000 and the chance to build something that did not belong to our parents. It did not come with favors. It did not come with shortcuts. If she took it, she would report to my director of outreach, not to me. She asked if I was sure. The question landed with more weight than the words contained. I said I was, and that being sure did not mean I had forgotten anything. It meant I believed the future deserved an honest trial. I told her to think about it for a week. She called back the next day. She said yes. On her first morning, she arrived early. I watched from my office as she stood in the lobby holding a paper folder and trying to decide where to wait. When I stepped out to greet her, I kept it simple. "Welcome," I said. "You are on the third floor, last desk by the window." I walked her to Human Resources, introduced her to the team by their first names, then handed her a 2-page document titled Expectations. It outlined the learning curve, the 30-day check-in, the 60-day performance review, and the 90-day decision point. The plan was not a threat. It was a set of ladders. The first weeks were awkward, not because of office politics, but because repair work always is. Abigail sat with the outreach team and listened more than she spoke. She learned the scholarship intake process, the vendor requirements for school supply drives, and the metrics we track to prove the programs are doing what we say they do. She took notes like a person who had been given a second language and wanted to keep it. The staff treated her with professional courtesy, which is the only kind worth counting on. I did not ask anyone to be her friend. Friendship is a gift, not an assignment. At home, Michael asked how it was going, and I told him the truth. It was going. Some days I felt the old ache rise like heat from a road. Some days I felt a lightness I did not trust yet. Leo liked the idea that his aunt worked at my office. He drew her a picture of a rocket ship labeled by Leo, added 3 stick figures and a dog, and told me to deliver it because astronauts always need something to look at during takeoff. I slid it onto her desk with a yellow note that said, "He insisted." She taped it to the side of her monitor before she opened her email. Outside our office walls, the investigation into the clinic moved from letters to outcomes. Restitution numbers were discussed in careful tones. Our parents appeared in court more than once. Their statements grew shorter. Their attorneys spoke more often than they did. Friends who had once introduced them at galas did not return calls. I did not watch every update. I learned the headline and left the rest to time. Some stories are not improved by being consumed in real time. In late July, our board approved the scholarship endowment I had been sketching in the margins for months. We named it the Lawson Scholarship Fund, but the first line of the charter made the ownership clear. The fund would exist under my reclaimed legal name, and any future use of the Lawson name for scholarships under our umbrella would require my written consent. The initial contribution was $500,000 from my account. We set the selection criteria to favor students who had lost educational opportunities to financial betrayal or family mismanagement. To apply, they would need a recommendation, an essay, and a transcript. They would not need a perfect record. They would need proof of resilience and a plan for how the money would change the next part of their story. That decision opened a space inside me that I had not known was still closed. I went home and sat on our white porch while the river wind moved the ferns and the late sun pulled gold out of the paint. I told Michael I felt like I had put my hand back on the steering wheel of my name. He said that was what he had been watching me do for years, step by step, until the direction of travel became undeniable. In August, the Georgia Women in Business Committee told me I would receive their Community Leadership Award at a gala downtown. I had spoken at their panels before, the kind where women tell the truth about money and ambition without lowering their voices. Still, I was not prepared for what it felt like to stand on a stage and look out at a room where so many of the people who had said yes to me over the years sat together. My first client had come, an operations director with a laugh that can fill a building. The executive who opened the door to my first merger was there, along with 3 women I had mentored who now ran their teams. Michael sat near the front, with Leo, who wore a small suit and looked like he had borrowed confidence from the future. I had written remarks, which is another way of saying I had decided in advance what I would not say. When it was my turn, I thanked my team, then announced the scholarship publicly. I named the fund after myself without apology. I explained the criteria and the first-year budget, which we had set at $100,000 to be divided among a cohort of students in the Southeast. I said the words financial betrayal out loud into a microphone and felt the air shift as women in the room recognized their private math. Afterward, people pressed my hands and told me pieces of their stories. An accountant who had kept her household afloat for 2 years after her partner hid debt. A teacher who had saved in secret because her parents considered her tuition a luxury. A nurse who had dropped out of college when her uncle emptied a trust that was supposed to hold her tuition and 20 years later, finished at night. None of them were seeking permission to be proud. They already were. They were telling me that the scholarship would land in places where the ground had felt unsafe for a long time. Abigail stood off to the side near the exit. She waited until the last cluster of people moved past me, then stepped forward. She held a small envelope. Inside was a program signed by our first cohort of outreach volunteers, the teenagers she had been coordinating for back-to-school drives in Chatham County. They had written thank you notes in Sharpie on the margins. She looked at me and said the only words that mattered. I am doing the work. I nodded. Keep doing it. September brought small, ordinary gifts. A colleague dropped off honey from a backyard hive. Leo lost his first tooth and asked the tooth fairy for $6 and a joke. Michael burned the pancakes twice and then laughed so hard he had to sit down. We drove to Tybee Island on a Sunday and watched shrimp boats move like slow handwriting against the horizon. I stood at the waterline and thought about how tides teach the shoreline to expect return without expecting control. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number from our old area code in North Carolina. I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to my mother speak in a voice that pressed each word into place. She said they were making amends. She said they were considering selling the house. She said she hoped I was well. The message ended, without a request for a callback. I deleted it and felt nothing that required a chair. At the 90-day mark, Abigail sat for her performance review with my outreach director, a woman who does not confuse kindness with softness. The review was solid, not perfect, solid. Attention to detail, growing, follow-through, reliable. Initiative, emerging. She had made 2 significant errors in scheduling and corrected them without deflecting blame. She had earned the next 90 days. She had not earned trust beyond that. Trust is built the same way a reputation is built, in increments, under light, with the record visible to anyone who cares to look. By October, the first scholarship applications began to arrive. I read essays at night after Leo's bedtime, 1 or 2 at a time, never more. I learned about a young woman in Macon whose mother used her college account to pay for a boyfriend's legal fees, and a student in Jacksonville who worked 2 jobs after a parent emptied her savings. Their words were clean and steady. None of them asked for pity. They asked for a chance to direct their lives without the interference that pretended to be protection. When our committee met, we argued carefully and landed on a cohort of 5. We called each one to deliver the news. Each call felt like a small hinge opening. The day the awards went out, we celebrated with cupcakes in the office kitchen. Abigail stood at the edge of the group, quiet, smiling the way a person smiles when she understands she is part of work that matters and that she is not the point of it. I caught her eye. We did not speak. We did not need to. That evening, I sat on our porch with Michael while Leo built a blanket fort that reached from the sofa to the bookcase. The river moved dark and steady beyond the houses. I told Michael something I had not said out loud even to myself. I was not interested in winning anymore. Not over my parents, not over the story, not even over the ache. I wanted to live the next part without measuring it against what came before. He reached for my hand. "That sounds like freedom," he said. I thought about that word, freedom, and how I used to imagine it as a door slamming with authority. It turns out it is quieter than that. It is the sound of a calendar that belongs to you. It is the scrape of a chair at your desk. It is the click of a light switched on in a room you paid for, the hum of a refrigerator you stocked, the soft thud of a backpack dropped by a child who knows he is safe. It is the decision to pick up the phone when you wish to and set it down when you do not. Months had passed since the wedding. The scandal had settled into whatever shape it would take for the long run. The apology had arrived and found its place. The scholarship had been launched. The job offer had turned into actual work. The story did not close with a gasp. It ended the way most real endings do, with people choosing their next actions and then living with them. I did not get revenge. I did not destroy anyone. I built a life that did not require their downfall to feel whole. When I look back now, I see the map differently. The loss that once felt like a cliff was a bend in the road. The betrayal that once looked like a wall was a door I only discovered because I had to keep moving. I can live with that. I can live with all of it. Before we went inside, Leo ran out to the porch, hair wild, eyes bright, and climbed into my lap. He smelled like soap and cut grass. He asked if we could read 2 stories instead of 1. I said yes. The porch light caught the edge of his grin and turned it into a promise. I carried him in through our front door, the one that opens to a house we chose, on a street we love, in a city that has given us back more than we knew to ask for. I closed the door behind us and felt the click travel through the quiet like a small uncertain bell.